In the town of Dust Devil, people knew to leave Elias Thorne alone. He was a ghost who walked in daylight, a man whose grief had carved silent lines onto his face, and his silence was a territory no one dared to cross. But today, that rule was broken. He left with strange cargo. A young girl, heavy with child, her eyes as vacant as a winter sky. The town held its breath and watched. No one dared to ask where he'd found her, or what he intended to do with her. They just watched, and wondered if the man who had lost everything was saving a soul, or simply dragging another one down into his own darkness. The air in the grimy lean-to behind the livery stable was thick with the smell of stale grain, horsehide, and cheap whiskey. In the flickering lamplight, the silence was heavier than the stench. Clara's wrists were still raw from the rusty manacles her mother had just removed. Her 8-month belly was a heavy, weary burden, each breath a struggle as she sat on the dirt floor, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "Still ain't got a man at her time," the mother rasped, her voice as dry as cracked earth. "A man like you," she sneered at the figure standing in the shadows, "ought to understand the value of a family." The man didn't rise to the bait. His gaze seemed to pass through them all, fixed on some distant point in his memory. His voice, when it came, held no command, no kindness, just a weariness that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. "I require quiet." The bargain was struck without another word. A handful of worn coins, a stoneware jug of amber liquid, and the promise of half a steer come autumn. The mother shoved Clara toward him as one would shove a sack of potatoes. "Don't. You give him trouble," she muttered, just loud enough for Clara to hear. "He paid more than you're worth." The man didn't touch her. He just gestured with his chin toward the tethered mare outside, her coat slick with sweat in the moonlight. Clara mounted slowly, her throat burning with tears that would not fall. The ride to his homestead was silent, broken only by the wind, whistling through the sagebrush and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the dusty trail. His homestead was a lonely island in a sea of dirt, with no fences, no neighbors. The wooden porch looked as if it had forgotten the sound of laughter for a decade. Inside, the air was strangely clean. No tobacco, no cheap perfume, only the scent of oak smoke and faint lemon. On the wall above the cold hearth hung a single, crooked photograph. A woman with bright eyes, her hands wrapped around an empty baby blanket. "You can stay here," he said, pointing to a small room. "The bed is sturdy enough. Water's by the stove. I won't enter without knocking." Clara said nothing. Her fingers brushed the outside of her worn boot, where a small dagger was neatly stitched into the leather lining. She gave a single nod and stepped inside. The room smelled of dried lavender and dust. The bed was covered with a finely made quilt, too beautiful for the rest of the house. A brush, a mirror, and an unused pair of shoes sat neatly beside the dresser. It wasn't a prison, but the feeling of being caged remained. That night, long after the coyotes began their song to the distant hills, Clara lay awake. One hand rested on her belly, feeling the stir of the life within. Her other hand clutched the hilt of her knife. She listened. There were no footsteps, only the wind and the occasional creak of old house beams settling. Near midnight, she slipped from the bed, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She crept onto the porch. A cold, whispering drizzle had begun to fall. And then she saw him. Not in bed, not watching her. He was on his knees on the wooden planks, oblivious to the rain that soaked his shirt. A lantern beside him cast a flickering golden circle. In that circle, his hands, slow and methodical, were threading a strip of new leather through the seams of a busted saddle. He was unaware of her. He was muttering to himself, to a ghost in the rain. She always said this place needed mending. Clara stood frozen, the dagger useless in her hand. He finally looked up, his eyes finding her in the darkness. He showed No surprise, only said, "Couldn't sleep?" She shook her head. He gave a single nod, then returned to his work, stitching his way through the silence and the falling rain. Back in her room, Clara hid the knife under her pillow. Not out of trust. Not yet, but out of something more complex, a feeling that hurt less than fear. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Each dawn, Clara would wake to find warm cornbread on a tin plate outside her door. The kettle would already be whispering on the stove. There were no notes, no questions. His silence was no longer menacing. Instead, it felt like a vast, empty space. The house was a shrine to a life that had ended. On the windowsill, a sewing circle sat with a needle still threaded, as if abandoned mid-stitch. Beside it lay a leather-bound Bible, its spine cracked and its pages softened by countless turnings, and there was always the woman in the portrait. She watched everything from the wall, her expression serene, neither happy nor sad. Just waiting. Elias never entered Clara's room, but the presence of his dead wife was everywhere. That peace was shattered one afternoon by a hard, rapid knocking at the door. Before Clara could react, Elias had opened it. A figure stood silhouetted against the harsh light, a woman whose face seemed carved from granite, framed by a severe black bonnet. "Martha," Elias said, his voice level. "Came for eggs," the woman snapped, her eyes sliding past him to fix on Clara. "And to see the girl you brought in." Clara instinctively stepped back, her rounded form impossible to hide even under her shawl. "Well, look at that," Martha hissed, her hands on her hips. "Round as a melon in harvest time." "What is it, Elias? Was the town too quiet without a scandal?" Elias didn't move. "Is this the new stray you've taken in?" Martha spat. "Didn't take you long, did it? Your wife's not cold in the ground, and you're hauling in some barefoot hussy from the flats. You always did like them young." Clara froze. The hidden dagger in her boot seemed to press against her ankle. But Elias just looked at the woman, his jaw set. "You want the eggs?" he said. "Take them." He turned inside, then returned with a small basket. He held it out without a word. Martha snatched it, her eyes still burning holes through Clara. "She won't last," she said. "Trash never does." Elias still said nothing. He took a single step back, his hand resting on the heavy oak door. The door swung shut with a quiet, final click that echoed louder than a slam ever could. After Martha left, Clara stood motionless for a long time. She waited for Elias to explain, to apologize, to tell her she wasn't what that woman had said. But he didn't. He returned to his worn rocking chair on the porch and began to whittle a piece of cedar, never looking up. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't denied it. He had simply closed the door. That night, Clara sat before the mirror, brushing her long hair. Behind her, in the reflection, was the portrait of the other woman, the wife, watching in stillness. Clara whispered, almost unconsciously, to the image in the glass, "He's more afraid of their words than he is of mine." And she understood then. He hadn't brought her here as an act of salvation. He had brought her here because the world had already passed its sentence on him, and he had long since stopped fighting the verdict. He wasn't her jailer. They were two prisoners of different sorrows, trapped in the same quiet house. Winter receded, making way for longer days. The frost on the ground retreated, revealing stubborn, new green shoots. A similar change was happening inside the house, not with a noise, but as gently as an exhalation. Clara no longer waited for Elias to leave before she dared to step outside. She became part of the rhythm of the homestead. Her hands, though clumsy, learned to hold a plank steady while he roofed the woodshed, or to pass him a handful of nails without a word needing to pass between them. In the evenings, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the sky outside turned from gold to deep indigo, a new ritual formed. Clara's voice, soft at first, would fill the quiet room with the ancient words of the Bible. She read slowly, and sometimes she would pause, "What do you suppose it means?" she asked one night, her finger pointing to a line, "when it says, 'Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning.'" Elias, carving a wooden spoon in his rocking chair, answered without looking up, "I reckon it means some things have to be empty before you know what's worth filling them with." One afternoon, she found him by the fence line, kneeling beside a row of newly driven wooden stakes. He was carefully pressing small pale bulbs into the freshly turned earth. "Roses?" she asked softly, stepping closer. "They never take," he said, his voice flat, still not looking up. "Then why do you do it?" He stopped, wiping the dirt from the back of his hands onto his worn denim trousers. He gazed out toward the ridge. "Because she always said they would. And I found I'd rather honor her faith than my own doubt." Clara swallowed the emotion that rose in her throat. She slowly knelt beside one of the bulbs, her own hands gently covering it with soil. "Perhaps this spring," she said, "we try again." For the first time, a flicker of something changed in his stoic face, a brief moment of surprise, of near disbelief. Then he gave a single, slow nod, the nod of a man who has just heard something he didn't know he needed to hear. That night, as the fire cast long shadows on the walls, Clara spoke into the stillness. "If it's a girl," she said, her hand resting on her belly, "I mean to call her Rose." Elias looked up from his whittling. His eyes met hers, quiet and steady. "She'll be stubborn," Clara added, a faint smile on her lips. "She'll grow where no one thinks she can, even if it takes time." Elias set his carving aside. He nodded not quickly, but with weight. "That's a good name," he said, "and a better hope." The silence between them that night was no longer a wall. It had become a field waiting for seeds to grow. For the first time in weeks, Clara did not dream of the mining town, of her mother's fists, or the smell of whiskey on a stranger's coat. She dreamt of sunlight through rose petals, of small hands tugging her braid, and of Elias smiling a smile not just with his mouth, but with his whole face. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange heat that silenced even the crickets. A low growl of thunder echoed from the distant peaks, and the sky in the west took on the color of an old bruise. Elias stood on the porch, his eyes narrowed, tasting the air. Then he smelled it, an acidic, biting scent of smoke. A hellish orange glow began to pulse against the horizon, like a wound opening in the fabric of the night. "Fire," he said, his voice urgent as he burst into the house. "On Briar Ridge. The wind's bringing it this way." Clara was setting the table when the first wisp of smoke drifted through the open window. She paused. The baby inside her shifted restlessly. "We have to go," Elias said, already grabbing blankets and plunging them into the water bucket. "The old stone hut." "North Trail. It's safe." Clara nodded, her heart racing. But as she turned to grab her shawl, a white-hot blade of pain sliced through her back, stealing her breath and forcing her to her knees. "Elias," she gasped, clutching the edge of the table. He was at her side in an instant, his eyes wide. "It's time," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. "The baby." Another contraction hit, harder, more vicious. Smoke began to thicken around them. The fire was coming fast. Elias didn't hesitate. He wrapped a wet blanket around her shoulders, the other around himself. Then he swept her up into his arms, the strength in him belying his lean frame, and plunged into the chaos, the world. Outside had become an orange hell. Ash floated through the air like snow, and the wind screamed across the fields, carrying sparks. The path to the stone hut was a desperate, winding track through a gully thick with tinder-dry scrub, and the fire was hungry. But Elias knew the way. He moved fast, his breath coming in short bursts. Clara cried out as another contraction racked her body. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't do this." "You can," Elias gritted out, his voice hoarse from the smoke. Just breathe, hold on to me. The fire was right behind them now, roaring like a wounded beast. Clara buried her face in his chest, trying to block out the heat, the fear, the pain. Just as her vision began to fade, they reached it. The stone hut was built into the hillside, half buried in the earth, a place of last resort. Elias kicked the door open, carried her in, and gently set her down on the straw-strewn floor. The thick stone walls were cool, untouched by the fire. Outside, the fire roared, but the stone muffled the sound to a distant, rolling thunder. Clara screamed as another wave of pain hit. She gripped Elias's hand, her nails digging into his skin. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I," he said, kneeling beside her, his voice no longer distant. "But you are not alone." Time passed in a blur of pain. Elias wiped her brow, whispered encouragement, held her hand through every groan. Finally, after a long silence, one last sharp, undeniable cry, and then, over the sound of the wind and the crackling brush, came another cry. High-pitched, new, and full of life. A raw, furious cry ripped through the stillness, a sound not of fragility, but of pure, defiant. "Life!" Clara gasped, her body trembling. Tears streamed down her soot-stained face. Elias held the small red bundle in his arms, wrapped it tightly in a cloth, and handed her over. "A girl," he whispered, his own voice breaking. Clara laughed and cried at once, taking her child into her arms. "Rose," she said. "She's Rose." Outside, the fire began to die. Inside, life had begun. In that quiet moment of relief, as Clara held their daughter, she heard a gasp. She looked over and saw Elias, his face a ghostly gray beneath the soot. He swayed, then collapsed to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. "No, no, Elias," she cried, trying to drag herself toward him. She pressed her ear to his chest. "Nothing." "Please," she begged, tears mingling with the ash on her cheeks. "Don't leave, not now." And then Rose cried. A piercing, angry wail that tore through the air like a summons. And then a sound from Elias, a ragged, desperate gasp for air, as if her cry had physically pulled him back from the precipice. His eyes fluttered open, then found Clara's face. "She's," he rasped, a faint smile touching his cracked lips, "got good lungs." The year that followed washed over the scorched land like a gentle rain. Spring returned, bringing a carpet of new green to the blackened hillsides. The quiet of the homestead was no longer an absence, but a presence, a peaceful hum punctuated by the babble of a child and the buzz of bees, and by the rebuilt fence. The roses had finally taken hold. They weren't the lush, perfect blossoms of a manicured garden, but stubborn, tender blooms of pale pink that clung to thorny stems. They weren't many, but they were enough. Their door was open now. The porch, once a place of lonely vigil, now saw visitors. They came hesitantly at first, leaving baskets of preserves or a freshly baked pie on the steps. One Sunday morning, Martha herself appeared. Her face was still grim, but her eyes were softer. Without a word, she placed a small hand-stitched quilt on the rocking chair and walked away. Clara never asked. She simply accepted. Life inside the house had found its own rhythm. She would find Elias at the kitchen table, his large, calloused hands that once only knew leather and iron, now patiently stitching the limb back onto a small rag doll. Sometimes when Rose would laugh, a low, warm chuckle would rumble in his chest, a sound that still made Clara's heart ache in the sweetest way. One evening, Clara stood on the porch, watching Rose toddle after a butterfly in the tall grass. Clara's own hand rested on the gentle curve of her stomach, where a new promise of life was quietly growing. Elias came to stand beside her, his arm resting gently around her shoulders. They watched their daughter, a small, determined figure in the vast healing land. The sun bled gold across the valley. Rose, with a wildflower clutched in her chubby fist, fell and rose again, undeterred. Sometimes, Clara said softly to him, and to herself, you have to walk through fire to find where the flowers grow.